Well, thank you, Kaz, so much for the invite, and thanks to all of you after a long, hard day at school for carving out an hour to cover sentientism. The first thing to mention, and Kaz has already done this brilliantly, is how to pronounce the word because it's a bit clunky. There's a few too many syllables, five of them. But the easiest way I find to say it is to start with the word sentient, then take a breath, then just add the ism on the end. But if you're practiced like Kaz, it will all flow together. And as Kaz said, it's may seem quite a new, unfamiliar worldview. The word itself was only coined in the 1970s, so it hasn't been around that long. But I think what you'll find as we go through this worldview is it draws on quite a lot of themes that you'll be very familiar with from the Dharmic religions, from the Abrahamic religions, and from other non-religious worldviews like humanism too. So it may feel a little new, but there's much here that will be familiar to you that's just being brought together in a different way. So what I wanted to try and do is give you an introduction to the worldview, what it is, what questions it's trying to answer, some of its history, where these ideas have come from, how it compares to some other worldviews and different isms, and then spend a little bit of time talking about how we might bring this into the classroom, because I think the ultimate aim here is to give you the confidence, if you think this might fit your curriculum and the sorts of things your kids are interested in, and how you can bring this worldview and some of its ideas actually practically into the classroom to get to the point where you might be able to be comfortable, running a lesson or a few lessons or even more about this topic. And because of the experimental work that's been done by other RE teachers around the country, I've brought some of those ideas back into some lesson ideas that I can share and we can discuss towards the back end of the session. So that's roughly the plan. But if you have questions as we go through, feel free to put your hand up or put something in the chat. But hopefully we'll leave plenty of time at the end for discussion, just to knock some of these ideas around. And hopefully everyone can see it okay. So just to set the context, Kaz mentioned that your group has been thinking about how to incorporate more non-religious worldviews into thinking. That's obviously a big theme in the religious education world more generally. And I think this context can help because as we look around the country, you'll see that there's quite a lot of people who say they have a non-religious worldview. If you look at the British Social Attitude Survey, because of the way they phrase the question, the numbers tend to be much bigger, but it roughly talks about, half of people across the country saying they have no religion. If you think about the census, the questioning is a little bit more leading, so the numbers are smaller, but the 2021 census suggests about a quarter of people in the country say they identify as having no religion. And it's pretty similar in Northumberland from the stats that I've seen too. And I think the most important thing to say about this is that we shouldn't jump to a simplistic conclusion here about what this means, because just as within religious worldviews, there's an enormous diversity of different views between those worldviews and within those worldviews. There are many people who strongly identify with a religious community that may not have supernatural or religious beliefs at all, but may have a community identification. The same wonderful complexity is true in the non-religious space. There are many people who may say they are non-religious, who might still have spiritual or supernatural views. They may have a mix of different opinions. They may identify with a more established non-religious worldview like humanism or sentientism, or they might have something that's much more amorphous and it's harder to put a label on. So that's a broad point here is there are lots of people who say they don't have a religious worldview across the country and around the world, but we should be really careful about jumping to simplistic conclusions about what those people believe and what they think. And to more context here, I'm very much, an amateur and I'm learning about the religious education space in the UK, is it does seem that there are some particular themes that come through the different curriculums I see based on different SACREs around the country and through my own work in schools with kids of all ages. And I've listed out some of these themes here that I think worldviews need to respond to. Those are ideas about diversity, discrimination, and identity. There's concern about environment and climate change and the impacts of those things on the world and on us as humanity. As adults, we're clearly concerned about misinformation, disinformation, conspiracism, problematic information on social media, but the kids in our classrooms are swimming in that stuff day to day and struggling to deal with those things. Topics about animal ethics and veganism come up more and more these days, partly because these ideas, I think, are more commonly talked about in our culture, but also because young people often have quite a visceral, direct relationship with non-human animals in their homes and elsewhere. So they're really interested in how we should think about animals and how we should treat them. There's obviously this somewhat sci-fi topic of artificial intelligence and technology, which is rapidly becoming less sci-fi and more, a present concern as people are thinking about the impact of things like ChatGPT and the various artificial intelligence tools on our practical daily lives and where those things might go in the future. And kids find that, somewhat daunting, but also fascinating. And then there's this, I think the reason why many of us love being in the classroom is that at all ages, there is just this rich sense of wonder, awe, and curiosity that many of our kids have, whatever their worldview, whatever their background, as just an openness and a curiosity in understanding the world we all share. So to reflect, the concepts and the structure of the Northumberland curriculum that you work with, you can see how these themes of beliefs and how we form beliefs, how we make connections between these different topics and between different groups or different ethical questions, and how we think about the social and practical impacts of these beliefs and these stances and these ethics run through quite richly through these ideas. And I think sentientism, from my experience so far, seems to resonate very strongly with young people because it does engage with each of these themes in quite a modern way. So I should come on to explaining what sentientism is. Like many religious and other non-religious worldviews, I think it's trying to answer some of the same really deep questions. Questions like what's real and what's true? How should we go about understanding this amazing world we all share? And just as importantly, the deep questions of ethics, what matters? What do right and wrong even mean? And critically, who matters too? And I summarize the way sentientism as a worldview answer those questions with evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when we're thinking about how do we go about understanding the world, what's real and what's true, sentientism suggests what you might think of as a broadly naturalistic epistemology. That's the technical philosophical term for it, to use that discipline lens. But in practical terms, that's using evidence and reason. Evidence as information from reality. It could be scientific evidence, but it can also be our life experiences, our senses, the things we experience in the world. Engaging with that stuff honestly to try and understand reality, and then using reasoning, careful critical thinking that's humble, open-minded, changing our mind when the evidence changes, being comfortable not knowing things, being comfortable being uncertain, but just taking a humble, open-minded, critical approach to trying to work out what's true, and never being trapped by dogma, never being too sure we're right about anything. So in that sense, sentientism shares that naturalistic evidence and reason-based approach with something like humanism. And, when I do school speaking about humanism, I'll introduce that in a very consistent way. When we come to the ethical questions, sentientism suggests we should have compassion for all sentient beings. So it's quite open-minded about what sort of ethical system we might apply philosophically, but it does insist that every sentient being should matter and should matter seriously. The obvious question is, what is a sentient being? So sentience comes from the Latin word sentire, which means to feel. And that's basically what sentience is. It's the ability to feel stuff or to have experiences. And it's quite similar to consciousness, but it's really about the ability to feel or experience things that are good or bad to us. So you might immediately think of pain and pleasure as obvious types of sentience. That could be good or bad, but they can be absolutely anything at all. It can be a feeling of excitement or frustration or boredom or existential angst or love, as well as the really basic, positive and negative physical feelings. So sentientism essentially says if you feel anything at all, if you experience anything at all, you should matter because you matter to yourself. And if we want to be moral, you should matter to us too. So it's pretty simple, but that's where evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings comes from. As I mentioned in the intro, although this is quite a new word and may feel like quite a new worldview, it's based on some deeply ancient ideas. So a good place to start in this diagram, which is just trying to show how some of these ideas flow down into sentientism, is in the middle when we're answering this what to believe, what's true, what's real question, taking this naturalistic approach that for some flows through down into atheism and agnosticism. For many, it doesn't. But I think that naturalistic way of using evidence and reason is as old as humanity. I think the earliest humans, hundreds of thousands of years ago, roaming on the savannah, they weren't doing philosophy, but in a way they were trying to make an honest understanding based on their senses and their experiences of what was going on in the real world. And if their beliefs were accurate, they might have a better chance of surviving, and if they weren't, they might be in trouble. So there's a sort of evolutionary reason why they would use evidence and reasoning to form their beliefs. And you could be even more radical and suggest that maybe the roots of this naturalistic way of thinking go even earlier than us humans, because many non-human animals, again, they're not writing philosophical papers, but non-human animals before humans existed, and I would argue still today, also do use evidence from their senses, from their experiences, from their lives, to try and understand and model the world so that they can survive in the world. And they do at least some rudimentary forms of reasoning. And the more we learn about non-human animals, the more impressed we are by the reasoning they're capable of. So this idea of naturalism, using evidence and reason to understand the world, is deeply ancient, maybe even pre-human. And then on the left-hand side, this is where the ethical question comes in, and critically, the question of who matters. So in most human cultures around the world through entire history, there's been an idea about morality and compassion and caring for some others. And often that ends up being expressed in a sort of universal way for humanity in general. But there's another really ancient theme here, which is suggesting that maybe humans aren't the only beings who should matter. So again, I'd argue that the roots of this idea, maybe non-humans could matter too, is again just as old as humanity. I think, 300,000 years ago, you go back to the earliest humans, even though they probably did lead lifestyles where, just to stay alive, they needed to hunt or harm non-human animals. I think they probably did have a sense that there was a difference between a wild boar and a rock. As they looked into the eyes of these other beings, they would realize there is a being there with their own experiences, and they're significant in some sense. And you can see that rippling through the animism theme that you'll find in a lot of ancient and today indigenous cultures, a recognition that, there's something that it's like to be at least non-human animals. So I think that idea is very, very old. And then you can see that run through lots of more modern historical cultures. So in the Dharmic religions, the idea of ahimsa, which in simple terms means doing no harm or non-violence, never meant do no harm just to humans. It meant do no harm to any being at all. Do no harm to a being that can be harmed. And a being that can be harmed is by definition a sentient being. So in a way, ahimsa is the Dharmic religion version of having compassion for all sentient beings. But you'll find that in religious worldviews and non-religious worldviews that flow richly through into the modern animal advocacy and rights movement. And those of you who cover modern philosophy will have come across people like Peter Singer, maybe Tom Reagan, the Godloviches, Bridget Brophy, Richard Ryder, who then sort of formalized and made this idea more academic that it's not just humans that should matter. In fact, maybe humans matter to each other, but not because we share the same species, but maybe us humans matter to each other because we are feeling beings. We care about our suffering and our flourishing. And if we care about the sentience of other humans, that's why we care about other humans. Maybe we should care about the non-human sentient beings too. So again, it's another really ancient theme of ideas. And if you bring these things together, that's where you get evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings and sentientism, this naturalistic way of us understanding the world and recognizing that any being that can feel pain, that can feel pleasure, that can feel anything at all should matter seriously. And on the right, there's the slightly more sci-fi thing, which can be really interesting to explore with kids in the classroom too, which is if we've come to this conclusion that it doesn't really matter so much whether you're human or not, and it doesn't matter so much which species you are or what type of animal you are. What matters is, are you sentient? Can you feel things? Are there other types of beings that might not be animals, might not be biological at all, that could also feel things? Could ChatGPT version 9 or even the current version feel something when you ask them a question and they give you a good answer? Or could we encounter, some form of alien species at some point that if they seem to be able to feel things, surely they should matter too, even if they're not human and even if they're not a type of animal we recognize. So that can be a really interesting thing to explore in the classroom too. If you really focus on this idea of sentience, maybe it doesn't matter who you are or what you are. If you're sentient, you should matter. I'm going to leave this slide mostly for, reading afterwards, because what it tries to do is to say, well, there's a bunch of other isms that relate to sentientism that you might be interested in, the contrasts and the differences. One is clearly is humanism. There's a common misunderstanding about humanism that it's only interested in humans, and that's not the case. The human in humanism, as many of you will know, is about us humans as moral agents being able to be good without God. So it doesn't say we should only care about humans. It says that it is up to us as humans to care. So many humans, and I'm trying to push humanism in this direction as well, already care very richly and deeply about non-human animals. It's not just about humans. But sentientism takes that really seriously. Instead of focusing on humans as moral agents, it says we should center the moral patients, the beings that can be impacted and that can be harmed, and those are the sentient beings. And it takes that really seriously. Whereas I think humanism is still a little bit uncertain about how seriously to take things like animal ethics. You can also contrast sentientism with some isms that go even beyond. There's ideas like biocentrism, where people will say, look, if plants and fungi aren't sentient, but they are alive, maybe they should matter intrinsically in their own right. Or you could go beyond that to ecocentrism, where you could think, well, actually, maybe ecosystems and rocks and rivers and trees and things that aren't even alive should matter in their own right too. So there are ideas that go even beyond sentientism. And then down at the bottom right-hand side, you can see, again, I mentioned the idea of ahimsa, do no harm. That's closely related to the more secular idea of veganism, which is in simple terms, a practical philosophical stance where we try not to cause harm, exploitation, and death to any sentient being. So that relates to sentientism quite richly too, although sentientism also opens the door not just to doing no harm, but maybe to helping and being benevolent. And sentientism is much more explicitly naturalistic in its way of understanding the world too. So you can look through those at your leisure. Having said I wasn't going to go through that, I've now done half of it, so apologies, but it gives you a sense. So here I wanted to start opening it up really and sharing some thoughts about how you might bring these ideas into the classroom if they feel like they fit. And I'd love to get your suggestions, feedback, ideas, questions as we go through this too, because I'm very much learning about the reality of the modern RE classroom. So I do think this sentientism worldview is quite well aligned with modern, more progressive RE objectives, because as I've been working with teachers and advisors around the country, it feels like many people genuinely want the kids in our classrooms to come out with critical thinking skills, with an ability to understand the worldviews of others so we can live happily together in a sort of pluralistic, multi-worldview society. That kids have actually got enough confidence to explore their own paths, although often that can be challenging for some groups and some communities and some families. And one of the challenges that's partly come from the Ofsted review is this idea of, instead of being maybe shallow and covering a longer and longer list of isms and worldviews, achieving real philosophical depth. And this sentientism idea, I think, is quite a good way of doing that, because all it has is philosophical depth. It doesn't have rituals or temples or priests or many of the other accoutrements that might go with a religious worldview. The only content of the sentientism worldview is answering these deep philosophical questions, the ones of epistemology and ethics. So I think it fits those objectives and that challenge quite well. In the classroom, it can also be a really interesting open gateway to the different disciplines and ways of knowing that you were talking about before, because when we're exploring different types of beliefs, and we'll cover some of those in one of the lesson plans later on, the answer sentientism gives is very rarely, here is the answer, go and memorize it, or here is the book, it will tell you the answer. It's quite often, I don't know, let's go find out. And the way to do that is to engage with the social sciences, with philosophy, with the hard sciences, with the humanities, to go and explore these things together, because intellectual curiosity and humility and open-mindedness is at the very heart of the worldview. It doesn't actually tell us what to believe at all. And again, I do think it links quite richly to the curricula and topics that we talked about earlier on. There's the ideas of diversity, discrimination, and identity. In a way, caring about sentient beings gives us another way of rejecting all the intrahuman discriminations and also extending our compassion out even beyond the human. And maybe there's another identity there of being a fellow sentient being. Maybe we can think about being a member of sentient kind or sentientity as an extension of humankind or humanity. It engages richly with the environment and climate topics because, again, it doesn't just think about those from the perspective of, are those concerns for us humans? It says those are also concerns for all of the maybe quintillion sentient beings living out in the wild. It explodes our interest in and the nature of the environment climate debate quite in a very interesting, powerful way. It engages very directly with these challenging topics about misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracism, because the core of the worldview, one of the two tenets, is about using good quality evidence and reasoning to understand what's real and what's true, and also working out who to trust, which organizations, which groups, avoiding YouTube grifters and, dodgy things on the internet, and explicitly helping kids develop the toolkit that will help them navigate that sort of stuff without ever telling them what to believe. Obviously, animal ethics and veganism plays in richly because it gives you a rational basis for thinking about those things, and extending our concern for all beings that can suffer and can experience. I mentioned the artificial intelligence and technology angle. Again, it's not just, these are fascinating tools and what might they do to humanity, but it adds in this interesting angle about at what point what might we need to care about, the next level of our Roomba or a ChatGPT as a moral patient in their own right. And of course, it plugs into this wonder, awe, and curiosity question, because using evidence and reason is one of the two core tenets. We're never telling the kids what to believe, but we're exploring this amazing toolkit to, explore the awe and wonder of the universe together. And there's a few different options that you can consider as you think about how to bring this into your classroom and into your curriculum. You can obviously cover it in full depth as a worldview. You can cover the basics. You can look at the different options within it. You can think about the nature of sentience. You can think about the epistemological approaches of how to use evidence and reasoning well. You can think about the ethical questions and the trade-offs those provide and what it means to live in that way. And you can think about its implications for all sorts of different fields of human endeavor too, which I'll come back to later on. You can also present it alongside humanism. So if you wanted to cover non-religious worldviews, you can talk about humanism and the way it uses evidence, reason, and compassion. And you can also talk about sentientism as an approach that does the same thing, but is much more challenging on our ethical scope, and it's much more challenging when we're thinking about non-human animal ethics. So you can almost put the two alongside each other and show how they challenge each other. You can cover it in a single lesson. So that's mostly what I've done so far in school classrooms from all ages, from 5 up to A-level students, of coming in 45 minutes or an hour, running a workshop. And I'll talk you through the script I used to guide that approach, just as a single shot, as an example of a different non-religious worldview that might spark some ideas amongst your kids. So you can do it as a single shot. And I'd love to do that again for free. I'm based down in London, but I'm happy to do it over Zoom, or maybe, if there's a critical mass, come up and visit if I can help you with that. But even if you don't cover sentientism as a worldview, I think there's two big themes here that you can plug into all of your work and address as you talk about every worldview. And I think they're quite often neglected in our work in religious education. One is quite often we're focusing on different worldviews and what people who hold those worldviews believe. Lists of belief, items of faith, tenets of a religion, as things we need to understand. But we don't often focus on how we know, the epistemology. What's the toolkit we should use for understanding? And sentientism helps to address that balance. So I think that even if you don't talk about sentientism as a worldview, as we're talking about all the other worldviews and what they believe, it's really interesting to ask, why do they believe those things, and how do they believe those things? Is it about using evidence and reason? Is it about faith or revelation or authority? What are the blurry areas between those different ways of knowing? And I think that can be a really interesting topic to explore, independent of any specific beliefs that we might be interested in. And I'd make a similar appeal on the ethical topic, because ethics and morality are a core part of every worldview, religious or not. But often the question about who matters gets forgotten, or there's an implied assumption that only humans matter. So a lot of writing and thinking that's done about morality implicitly and silently assumes that humans are the only ones we should care about, and now we'll go and develop an ethical system. But I would put an appeal here to ask that question, who matters is almost as important, maybe even more important, partly because if we get that answer wrong, it can lead to the problems of racism and sexism and homophobia and intrahuman discrimination that we see. That's an error of thinking about who matters and inclusion. But it also shuts us off from thinking about non-humans and the topics of animal ethics and veganism and those other important questions too. And we can ask those in the context of every worldview. What does a Christian view mean for animal ethics? What do the Dharmic religions mean for animal ethics too? And some of the terminology I'm using here, obviously, I'm talking to teachers here, and some of the terminology, epistemology and philosophy and so on, can feel a little bit like it might be suited for older students. But I think you can bring this into the classroom at absolutely every age, and I do that myself. I've run workshops from early years to all the way through KS1 and all the way up. And the way I think we can do that is by choosing the different types of inquiry opportunities, the sorts of questions we ask and get kids to ask in the classroom, because you can start with very basic questions about, what do you believe? Why do you believe that? How can we work out what's true? How sure should we be that we're right? Who should we care about? Does animal suffering matter? Do animals matter? Why should we care? These are questions that 5 and 6-year-olds can engage really richly and powerfully, and they're, in my experience, way better philosophers than the average adult on Twitter, although that is an extremely low bar. But even the youngest kids can have brilliant conversations and really powerful workshops, discussions around that. As you get older, you can move beyond that and start thinking about the epistemology and the ethics and what are the different options. So, how do we use evidence and reason well? What are the risks even in using if you use evidence and reason badly? When you think about our moral scope and who we care about, you can also introduce all the different ethical variants. You can think about rights or utility or virtue ethics or feminist care ethics there. And then with older students, you can start thinking about its implications too. And I'll come back to an example about how we might do that later on. What would a sentientist world look like? You can run a model UN where you reimagine the Sustainable Development Goals or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or our political systems based on this worldview. And you can have some fascinating, radical, world redesign exercise that you can run in workshops with older kids. So that's the main point, really, is, I think we can frame this to make it interesting for every age. So I've got 4 examples here of particular lessons. I'm not going to expect you to read this, but you can look at the slides when we send them around later. But this is roughly how I run a single lesson, where I just sort of drop into a curriculum, understand what the teacher and the kids are trying to achieve, and tell the story. So it's very simply, as I've done here, introducing sentientism as a non-religious worldview that's trying to answer some of the same deep questions as other worldviews, summarizing it using this evidence, reason, and compassion story, covering those basics, telling a little bit of a story about what sentientism means for me, focusing on freedom, community and cooperation, curiosity, and this sense of awe, wonder, and connectedness that I find in a humble, partial, halting understanding of the real world. You can run activities around these ideas as well. And a closing that talks about the commonality between sentientism and other worldviews, where rich themes of compassion run through most worldviews and through sentientism too, and rich themes of intellectual curiosity and inquiry and curiosity run through many other worldviews, as they do through sentientism. So that's just an example of how you can run a half-hour or 1-hour session. This one is a little bit more involved and might be more appropriate for older kids, but it can be fun to do, where we're focusing on these 2 deep questions. How do we work out what's true and who matters? And you can divide the room up into different quadrants. So first, you can ask kids to arrange themselves on a spectrum from bottom to top, based on when they're thinking about what's true and what's real, about the most important questions in life. Do they tend to use a sort of evidence and reason, maybe a more scientific approach for most things? Are they tend to draw more weight from faith or authority or revelation or something fuzzy in between? And where would they put themselves in the room along that spectrum? And then we ask the second big question, which is about who matters. And of course, you can stretch the spectrum more broadly than this, but the quadrants here are, all human beings matter, assuming that most kids in our class would agree with universal human rights, or all sentient beings matter. So again, you can get kids to position themselves left to right along that spectrum, and they'll end up in one of those quadrants, maybe more towards the corners or maybe more towards the center or somewhere else. And then you can present a challenge to each of those quadrants, where you can say, well, it's great that you're committed to using evidence and reason, but what if the evidence leads you in a way that challenges a belief you really want to hold on to? Are you sure you'd follow the evidence and reasoning wherever it goes? In a similar way, if you're more drawn to faith or authority or revelation, what if that source of authority suggested something you really didn't want to believe was true? So you can challenge both of those different uh, choices and see if people might move around a little bit. If people are positioned on the other spectrum, and they say, well, all human beings matter and that's where I want to stick, you can ask them some challenging questions. Well, aren't there wild animals you might care about? How about the cats and dogs or fishes or rabbits that you might share your home with and think of as family members? Are you sure you want to draw the line at all human beings? Surely there are some sentient beings you should care about. But if someone's positioned themselves in caring about all sentient beings, there are challenges there too. What implications does that choice have for things like animal agriculture, right? Does being in that quadrant mean logically you should be vegan? And are you willing to, take that step, right? So I think in each of these quadrants, you can challenge it, ask kids those questions and see if they move around in the room. So that can be a really fascinating way of exploring these two often deeply neglected questions. So that's the second idea that could be good fun, sometimes with slightly older kids. Here's another one for older kids where, like any worldview, because worldviews, to my mind, affect everything we think about the world. They are our view on the world. They touch everything, every belief and every value we have. You can do a range of really interesting thought experiments as you look across all the different domains of human knowledge and think, how would this be different if we genuinely took this, for example, sentientist approach? How might we think differently about environmentalism? What would a sentientist education system look like? How would it operate differently? What would our agricultural systems look like if we cared about all sentient beings? What about economics? Economics is mostly about value and transactions between humans, but what if we recognized value as experienced by non-human animals? What radical things might that do to our economics if we had to price in things like animal suffering? What about the sentientist development goals? Those are mostly written because us humans are worried about the climate and the environment. But if we rewrote them to also have a genuine concern for non-human animals in the wild, in our farms and in our labs, how different would the sentientist development goals look like? We've already run quite a range of interesting thought experiments about rights. You can take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and rewrite it as a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights that extends rights to non-human animals and maybe even to artificial intelligences. And the list goes on. Sentientist politics. Should chickens and fishes be represented in our parliaments, for example? So again, there's a whole range of different fascinating thought experiments or model UN sessions or brainstorms or breakouts that you can run around these ideas. For the final, is this making sense, by the way? I know I'm just sort of driving relentlessly on, but feel free to ask a question or stop if you want me to pause for a moment. Otherwise, I'll just keep going and then open up for questions. So the final question example is maybe a little bit more developed. And I think this can work again with primary age kids and maybe a little bit older too, with just some slight tweaks to the language. So what this tries to do is to take you through a story about sentientism and helps you as a student experience what it's like to explore some of these questions yourself. So it starts with the introduction of sentientism as a non-religious worldview. And again, as I've said a few times now, right, answering what's true with evidence and reason and who matters with compassion for all sentient beings. And then it takes us through those two different questions. So you can start, and you can do this on post-it notes or on the board or get kids to get involved and ask them, what are the most interesting beliefs that are out there? What are the most exciting beliefs that are out there? What are beliefs you think are true or aren't true, but what are the most interesting? And this can be so much fun to explore in the classroom. Am I made from the dust of exploding stars? One of my favorites is, are bananas our cousins, which can be quite entertaining to explore. As you point out to kids that they're not just cousins with everyone in the classroom, but they're cousins with their teacher, they're cousins with all humans, they're cousins with all animals, but ultimately they're cousins, albeit distant, even with the banana they had for breakfast. So you can explore all sorts of different beliefs that the kids may or may not believe, or other people may or may not believe. And that could just be a fascinating explosion of different ideas. But the important thing is then to ask the follow-on question. And I'd argue this is even more important than whether these things are true or not, which is to ask, how do we think, how do we work out which of these things are true and what are good reasons for believing and what are not so good reasons for believing? So again, you can do this on post-it notes or on a whiteboard or kids in their exercise books to come up with these sorts of answers. Well, I saw it with my own eyes. I heard it as a rumor. Someone told me so. It's written in the Bible, so it must be true. There was a guy on YouTube who told me this thing. There's a scientific consensus around it. There's all sorts of different ways of reasons for believing or for not believing. And to explore these with kids can be fascinating and good fun. And Sentientism as a worldview, again, similar to humanism, has a suggestion for how we can go about this stuff. And it suggests that if we're in a pattern of thinking on the left-hand side, where we might hear ourselves or other people say, yeah, I'm always right. I'm 100% sure. I believe whatever they say. I don't want to know more. Nothing will ever change my mind. There's a pattern there that I guess we're trying to resist and say, well, you may be locked into a particular pattern of thinking that might not be well linked to reality. And it can be quite fun. I'll quite often ask this question in the classroom and say, is there anyone here who thinks they're always right about everything? And there's always one little boy who will put their hand up and say they are. But it's reassuringly rare, right? Nearly everybody recognizes, even young kids, that they might be wrong about some things. And instead, I guess Sentientism suggests we should try and adopt the pattern of thinking on the right, asking why and how, being curious, admitting we don't know stuff, admitting we're unsure about stuff, wanting to ask, how good is this evidence instead of just accepting it unquestioningly, wanting to think about how much should we trust them rather than just, following the person on TikTok in whatever they say. And that leads to this, approach in the middle, really asking questions and never stopping asking questions, looking at the evidence and querying it and challenging it and never stopping doing that, thinking carefully and never stopping doing that, and being ready to change our minds and never stopping that too. This idea of a lifelong curiosity, lifelong openness, and a lifelong learning and pattern of thinking. So that focuses in on the belief lens of way of knowing, if you like. It's what sorts of things do people believe, but more importantly, how do they believe and why do they believe, and are those good reasons? So it focuses quite hard on that lens. The next question then comes more onto the philosophy lens, particularly focusing on this ethical question. And this can be quite a fun exercise to run too, because this is actually Luna, the puppy, who's downstairs. Sometimes she joins my Zoom calls, but I think she's guarding the back door at the moment. This baby is not mine. That is a generic internet baby. Mine are now 19 and 21 years old, and so I didn't want to put a photo of them up. But this can be a really interesting way of introducing kids to these basic ethical questions about who matters and what does that mean. So you can start on the top left by asking whether these beings are sentient. Do we think they feel things? If you accidentally tread on the paw of a puppy, or you feed them a treat, or you cuddle the baby, will they feel good or bad things? Does that mean they matter morally? Should we care about them? What is it like to be them? If we really genuinely try and empathize, it's impossible to understand exactly what it's like to be a puppy or a baby or even each other. But, making that effort is morally important. As part of that, we think about what good things do they feel? What bad things do they feel? What things do they want and what things don't they want? And then you get into the ethical implications. Should we help them? Should we hurt or kill them? Hopefully, most kids will be pretty comfortable how we answer that question. Should we pay others to hurt or kill them? Are they who or what? Are they it or thems or he's or she's? Are they objects? Are they someone or something? Are they names or numbers? Should they be owned or bought or sold? And you can work through that pattern with these somewhat obvious answers given the pictures in the middle. And then the challenge for sentientism, and this is a tough challenge, is you ask the same questions, but with a radically exploded variety of sentient beings in the middle. So some of these are animals that live in farms or laboratories. Some are living free-ranging in the wild. There's all of the other humans, young and old, we might consider. There are some types of animals here that are quite unfamiliar, where we may not be sure if they're actually sentient. The evidence about shrimps is pretty convincing, but what about bivalves or mollusks or jellyfishes? So again, you can go through and ask these same questions, and with kids, explore whether they're answering these questions consistently or whether there's something different going on in our minds that might have implications. Now, one of the obvious places that can lead you, and this is a place where, as RE teachers, you're very used to dealing with sensitive and somewhat contentious topics, is an example that might center on farmed animal ethics. So you have to judge whether your kids are ready for this stuff and how to frame it and how to put it. But this again is asking that basic ethical question, is just as we do with other humans, we think about, what lives do other humans want to live? Long, happy lives with their families, and, what lives do they actually have? And do we feel a moral tension between those things, particularly when we're the ones who might be choosing the difference, or when our institutions or our governments or our organizations are the ones choosing the difference? And this example is exploring that with farmed animals, of contrasting the lives these animals want to have and the lives these animals likely do have on farms. But there's so many different thought experiments you can run, and you don't just have to focus on non-human animals. Of course, you can introduce the idea of digital minds or maybe sentient artificial intelligences and ask exactly the same sorts of questions. It may be hard to imagine what an artificial intelligence might even be interested in, right? They presumably wouldn't feel physical pain in the same way we do. So, what would they want? What would they be interested in? And that could be fascinating to explore in the classroom. But then you can lead through into the social sciences lens and into the aspect of your curriculum that's thinking about connections and impacts too. So there's plenty of work we can do here by asking questions about, if we've worked through how to understand the world and we've worked through this ethical challenge of really trying to care about all sentient beings, what might that mean practically, and what could we, our school, our families, or our governments do to help? And there's some mind-blowing numbers here, of course. Maybe there's quintillions of wild sentient animals. We might be familiar with an injured deer in a local wood, or a duck that has a broken wing by the local pond. But those are two of maybe quintillions of wild animals, most of which we'll never experience. There are farmed and wild caught sentient animals. You can ask the question about whether we should be farming them or catching them at all if we have other alternatives, given what that does to those beings. And you can run through the questions. There's the companion sentient animals that live in our homes. This perspective doesn't just have radical implications for things like farming or laboratory animals. It might also change the way we think about the dogs and cats and fishes and rabbits that we share our homes with. They're not objects of entertainment or things that are fun for us to own, right? They are beings in their own right. Maybe that should change the way we behave with the puppy as we take them for a walk, right? Maybe we should let them sniff rather than yanking on their lead. And then again into the sentient artificial intelligences and robots. Asking that question: could they be sentient? Should they matter? And what should we do about it? So there can be some really interesting, advanced sci-fi brain exploding stuff, and then there can be some really practical things where kids in the class might be interested in initiatives like plant-based schools that are helping schools shift towards more plant-based catering, or there might be other types of practical things they want to take out into the real world in this sort of social science impact lens. And I think the final point I wanted to make here, which is probably a nice way to close, is again to re-emphasize the connections between and the overlaps and the productive common ground between lots of different worldviews, religious or not. Of course, there's a different emphasis within many religious worldviews on faith, authority, or revelation, but many religious worldviews have a rich sense of inquiry and scientific exploration and using evidence and reason to understand the world. So there's much powerful overlap there. And this slide is focusing on the sentient beings question, because again, almost every worldview you go through actually has quite a progressive stance about how we should care about non-human animals. And sometimes that's been obscured by modern culture, whether it's in the Dharmic or the Abrahamic religion. But there's some really interesting stuff to dig into here, whether you're talking about sentientism or whether you're talking about these other worldviews and the way they think about non-human animals. So obviously in the Dharmic religions, we've talked about the idea of ahimsa already, which richly links to this idea about caring about other sentient beings. In Islam, there are ideas like mafsada, khalifa, halal, and the purity ideas, and some very explicit things in the Quran itself and the hadiths talking about avoiding animal cruelty and exploitation. In Christianity and Judaism, again, there's love and stewardship of God's creation, a reinterpretation of what dominion means, a recognition that the Garden of Eden was vegan. There's probably no slaughterhouses in heaven. The Isaiah talks about the lamb and the lion lying down together. And there's an interesting quote there from the Catholic Catechism, which I wasn't aware of, which was talking about it being contrary to human dignity to cause animals to suffer or die needlessly. And the list goes on. Essentially the point there is, as kids are exploring different worldviews, it's just as important to understand these overlaps and these areas of common ground as it is to understand the differences too. So there's a bunch of different resources and help, loads of links you can click on. There's our YouTube channel and our podcast, which are probably more appropriate for either older students or for you all as teachers. There's some RE Today materials. There's some veganism and education materials that talk about sentience and sentientism. There's the American Institute for Humane Education. There's our own sentientism.info page where we have a dedicated Sentientist education page, and we have a dedicated Facebook chat for anyone who's interested in joining too. But I guess most importantly, I would just love to help. So if you want to reach out to me via social media or on my email when we send the slides around, even if it's just for a casual chat or if it's to help plan a lesson or you want me to Zoom in as a school speaker, I would absolutely love to help, because as you can probably tell, I love talking about this stuff, and I should probably stop now and leave the rest of the time for questions, feedback, discussion about how relevant you think this might be, where it might fit in the classroom, and how I can help you make that happen.